So, who is actually responsible for the crisis in Ukraine? I mean, the story we usually hear in the West is pretty clear. It's Russia's fault. But way back in 2015, the well-known political scientist John Mearsheimer laid out a completely different and pretty controversial argument. So today we're going to break down his thesis, using his logic, his evidence, to really get inside his perspective. Right, so this is the big question Mearsheimer wants to tackle. Let's just, for a moment, set aside everything we think we know. We're going to dig into this from the ground up, based completely on his realist take on how big powers act on the world stage. And boom, there it is. Mearsheimer's whole argument in a nutshell in his own words. It's a really bold claim, right? It just flips the entire narrative on its head. He's saying that the policies coming out of the United States and Europe were actually the main drivers of the crisis. So let's explore why he thinks that. Okay, so how on earth does Mearsheimer get to a conclusion like that? Well, he builds his case by looking way past the events of 2014. He focuses on what he calls the deep causes, the big structural things that were setting the stage for this conflict for years and years. See, for Mearsheimer, this crisis didn't just pop up out of thin air. He argues it was the totally predictable outcome of a Western strategy that had been going on for decades. A strategy that he says was all about pulling Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and bringing it into the West's camp. And he breaks the strategy down into three main parts. First up, you've got NATO expansion. That's the military alliance pushing further and further east. Then there's EU expansion, which is all about economic integration. And third, something he calls democracy promotion, which he argues Russia saw as just a fancy term for trying to install pro-Western governments. To Moscow, this whole package looked like a massive threat to their very existence. And this right here is the moment Mearsheimer points to as a huge turning point, that 2008 NATO declaration in Bucharest. Russia's reaction was instant and crystal clear. Putin himself called it a direct threat to Russia. From Mearsheimer's point of view, this was the West blowing right past the line that Russia had clearly drawn in the sand.
But here's the thing, all these huge external pressures from Russia on one side and the West on the other, they weren't being applied to a stable, unified country. Mearsheimer says that to really get what happened next, you have to understand the deep, deep fractures running right through Ukraine itself.
This chart gives you a really striking picture of that split. Based on polling that Mearsheimer cited, public opinion was basically cut right down the middle. People in the western part of the country, overwhelmingly pro-EU. People in the east, they favored a customs union with Russia. This wasn't just some minor policy disagreement, it was a fundamental divide over the country's entire future. So you've got these powerful internal splits over language, identity, which way the economy should face. According to Mearsheimer, this internal weakness is precisely what made Ukraine a geopolitical fault line, just waiting to be torn apart by the tug of war between the West and Russia. And that brings us to what he calls the precipitating cause. So if Western expansion was the fuel that had been piling up for years, what was the actual spark that Mearsheimer says lit the whole thing on fire in February 2014? This timeline shows just how incredibly fast everything went downhill. It all kicks off when Ukraine's pro-Russian president Yanukovych turns down a deal with the EU and takes one from Russia instead. This leads to the massive Maidan protests. Things just spiral. And even though a deal is reached for new elections, it's not enough. Yanukovych flees and a new pro-Western government moves in. Mearsheimer controversially calls this whole sequence of events a coup. From Mearsheimer's perspective, this was it. This was the final straw. Seeing a democratically elected president on Russia's border overthrown with what he saw as clear backing from the West, that was something Putin was just not going to accept. In his analysis, this event is what directly triggered Russia's military response. Which leads us to Russia's reaction. Now, while everyone in the West were shocked and outraged by what Russia did, Mearsheimer argues that their actions were completely predictable. Why? Because, as he says, great powers will always act to protect their vital interests right in their own neighborhood. And he makes this really powerful comparison to America's own Monroe Doctrine. The U.S., he points out, would absolutely never, ever tolerate China setting up a military alliance with Mexico. So he asks, why would we expect Russia, another great power, to act any differently when a hostile military alliance wants to set up shop in Ukraine, a country that is strategically vital to them? So, looking at it through this cold, realist lens, Russia's response followed a pretty clear two-step logic. Step 1, take Crimea. Why? To lock down their crucial naval base at Sevastopol and make sure it could never, ever become a NATO base. Step 2, wreck Ukraine. Basically, destabilize the eastern part of the country to make sure it stays a dysfunctional buffer state, making it a completely unattractive and impossible candidate for joining NATO.
This slide, this right here, really gets to the core of how Mearsheimer frames this whole thing. He sees it as a fundamental clash between two totally different ways of seeing the world. On one hand, you have the West, acting like 21st century people who think that old school ideas like spheres of influence are dead and gone. But on the other hand, you have Russia and Putin, who he says are still playing by the hardball 19th century rules of great power politics. And in his view, the West just completely failed to understand who they were dealing with.
So, if that was his diagnosis of the problem, what was Mearsheimer's proposed solution? What was the way out of this mess that he suggested back in 2015? His solution was basically to hit the reset button and go back to how things were before what he calls the West's big mistake. He argued for Ukraine to become a neutral buffer state, kind of like Austria was during the Cold War. For that to happen, the West would have to officially give up on NATO expansion into Ukraine, create a big economic rescue plan that actually included Russia, and push for real guarantees to protect the rights of Russian speakers inside Ukraine. And here it is, his incredibly stark and many would now say prophetic warning from that 2015 lecture. Mearsheimer argued that by encouraging Ukraine to get tough with Russia, by dangling this idea of joining NATO, the West was leading Ukraine down the primrose path. A path that looks beautiful but leads straight to disaster. He believed it was a policy that would end up destroying the very country it was supposed to be helping. And this leaves us with the really difficult, uncomfortable question at the very heart of Mearsheimer's entire argument. His realist solution forces us to think about a pretty brutal trade-off. Is it okay to limit a smaller country's right to choose its own path, to choose its own allies, in order to keep a neighboring great power happy and feeling secure? It's a question that really challenges our modern ideas about how the world should work, and it's a question that's more relevant now than ever.